and welcome to the David Frum Show. I'm David Frum, a staff writer at The Atlantic. My guest this week will be Tim Miller, host of the Bulwark's daily podcast. My literary topic this week won't be a book. It will be a discussion of the ritual and performance of the State of the Union address, and I will get to that after the interview with Tim Miller. But first, some opening thoughts on the dramatic recent events. There's so many that one can hardly begin to tally them all. I record this podcast the day before the president is to deliver the State of the Union address. You will see it or hear it the morning at the earliest, the morning after the president gives the State of the Union address. So you will know more than I do about what happens. I have no idea, although I can make some guesses. I'm going to guess there's going to be a lot of ranting and raving in the State of the Union address about the Supreme Court and the recent tariff decision. And one of the questions that should spring to mind is, why is the president so very, very upset that the Supreme Court struck down the tariffs he's been announcing over the past year? I mean, I get it. No one likes to lose. This is an important issue for him, but it's not like he doesn't have recourse. He continues to hold a majority in both House and Senate. The Supreme Court has said your tariff measures would be fine if they came from Congress. You just can't do them alone. Why not announce in the State of the Union, I've drafted a tariff bill. I'm sending it to Congress tomorrow. I look forward to you enacting it at your earliest convenience. There are enough Republicans, enough in this House and Senate, and there's some anti-trade Democrats. You might get a majority. Why not just pass the bill and do it the legal way that the Supreme Court pointed out to him? Why is he falling back instead on all these convoluted other schemes for using imaginary balance of payments crises, which don't really exist anymore in a day of floating exchange rates, or false claims of unfair trade practices? Why not just write a tariff bill and send it to Congress and have them pass it? Well, once I say it that way, you know why he's so upset. Because for Trump, the appeal of the tariffs was not just his primitive mercantilist view of international economics. He loved the feeling of raw, arbitrary, discretionary power he got from a tariff mechanism that he insisted, and the Supreme Court just corrected him on, that he insisted he could apply to anyone at any time for any reason, without permission from anybody, Congress least of all. What he is mad about is not that he's lost his tariffs. He could enact them. What he is mad about is that he has lost his power. And that, I think, will be a real theme of the State of the Union address. The president's desire to insert personal, arbitrary, whimsical, if need be, power, unlimited by anybody or anything. That power comes to its sharpest point when the issue is one of war and peace. Congress has not had a chance to debate, but we are very apparently on the edge of a major war in the Middle East against Iran. The president has assembled an enormous amount of air and naval resources within striking range of Iran. He has made threats. People around him have made threats. They say they want a negotiation, but they point to the revolver on the table and warn that the revolver will go off. And war seems to be imminent. And it may be even an unintended war. It may be a war that Trump thinks he can sort of bully the Iranians into acceding to what he wants to do. They don't, and then he's trapped. He has to go to war, even though he thought he could intimidate them. And turn that. And when and if that hope or expectation turns out wrong, he's backed into a position where force is his only remaining recourse. This again is arbitrary power. Congress is supposed to vote on these things. There's no figment or tissue of any kind of authority that the president has to initiate this kind of major regime change conflict that he has in mind with Iran without the approval of Congress. So what we're going to see is a drama of the tension between a president who wants personal power and a constitutional system that is designed to deny the president personal power. That is why I think these alternative tariff regimens that are being discussed by the administration are ultimately going to collapse and may well be rejected by the courts, because the alternative forms of presidential tariff power all require a lot of process, all require a lot of explanations, all have rules. They have preconditions that must be met, time limits that must be met. There are opportunities they must be taken. Some of them must go to court, where there are opportunities for the tariffed party to make itself heard and to say, I did not engage in the unfair trade practice alleged by the president. And under this trade power, Section 301 as it's known, you don't just take the president's word for it. There is a process and a hearing, and the accused party gets to make itself heard. So we are going to see a drama of the individual will meeting institutional limits. And that may be the theme of the rest of this political year and the rest of the Trump presidency. The Trump drive to individual unchecked power has met some rebuffs, but with war in the offing, he may have his greatest opportunity yet to remake the United States as the kind of one-man system that he wants it to be. And now, my dialogue with Tim Miller. Tim Miller is known to all, or should by now be known to all, as the star host of the Bulwark's Daily podcast. He is also the author of the 2022 New York Times bestseller, Why We Did It, a travelogue from the Republican Road to Hell. Tim is a veteran of Republican presidential campaigns, McCain 08, Huntsman 2012, Jeb Bush 2016. He built a consulting business before switching to full-time journalism for the Never Trump fight. I've been privileged to be his guest on many, many occasions on the Bulwark, and it's a pleasure to be able to return the hospitality at last. Tim, thank you so much for joining me today.
Let's do this. My gold jacket guest, David Frum. It is my honor to be in the other seat.
All right, I want to ask you just a brief question, because it's not impossible that there is someone who is unaware of the Bulwark. Can you take us through the rich and varied Bulwark cinematic universe? What is the Bulwark? Where did it come from? How did you join this crew?
Sure. It is the unofficial. Before you started your podcast, it was the unofficial podcast of The Atlantic. I had so many Atlantic guests, so I assume most people do know us. But so I'll keep it brief. But the Bulwark was the shorthand version of it. Starting was it was built out of the destruction of the Weekly Standard. My old friend Sarah Longwell had a terrible idea, which was to start a Never Trump aggregator website. I told her as much, but she just wanted to do something. She was so mad about Trump. She is, like me, had a past in conservative PR and communications work. And, the site had been around for a couple months or whatever when the owner of the Weekly Standard, the old Neocon magazine, shut it down. And so a bunch of people were out in the wilderness. Sarah had met Bill Kristol in particular at a lot of meetings of sad Republicans in the basements, some of which you've attended.
I've attended some of those sad meetings.
One was called the Meeting of the Concerned. I love that name, The Meeting of the Concerned. We were all very concerned. And they were just talking. They're like, what can we do? And it's like, hey, maybe this little aggregator thing I had, we can start something else and see how it goes. And that's how the Bulwark was born. It was basically a side hustle for a lot of people. My colleague Jonathan Last took over the editorship, and it was a real hustle for him. But for a lot of folks, it was something that they were doing because it felt good to have a place for Never Trump Republicans to gather and to write and to give their opinions and to vent and lament. And I had been friends with Sarah, so she asked me to do it. As you mentioned in the intro, I was still doing PR work full time. And, it took off beyond our wildest imaginations. Like Charlie Sykes at The Daily Show at that time. And, he brought over his audience from the Weekly Standard, and JVL's newsletter writing, enraptured a lot of people. And, we brought in a lot of guests from the universe. And I would hear from people that the audience wasn't just Never Trump Republicans. That was kind of the core base. A lot of people that had used to be Republicans but were turned off by Trump. But it was also a lot of liberals. I'm sure you hear this, David, who were like, I have this uncle or best friend or son or mom or whatever who I used to argue with, and I can't argue with them anymore because they've gone so insane. And now you guys are like this is what it would be like if my beloved family member who is a conservative had not totally lost their mind, and we can have legitimate disagreements about this issue or that issue. And that was kind of the genesis of it. It went from being everybody's side hustle to a real deal. I think during that crazy summer and a half ago where, with the Biden debate and then Trump getting shot and, we had got onto YouTube and, it really just took off.
Can we sum up the politics of the Bulwark as pro-market, anti-polio?
Pro-market, anti-polio? Yes. My favorite summation that anyone ever gave us was the capitalist wing of Antifa. Maybe not quite right, but I did like it. It has a nice ring to it. So yeah, look, we're pro-markets, anti-polio, anti-liberalism. And I think a lot of folks now come to us because we're no bullshit, honestly. And that was the point I was trying to make about YouTube. There are a lot of people who don't know this backstory, who just saw our material on social media now and are like, we like the cut of their jib. And they don't have to know about, Hayek or Buckley or the, history of conservatism to appreciate the content.
So you had a big outing last week. You took the much of the staff, maybe all of the staff of the Bulwark, to Minneapolis to do a live performance there, but also to do some on the ground observation of a situation you have spoken so much about. What did you see other than I assume a lot of snow and ice?
Yeah, I did get a cold. I was not built for Minneapolis. And so it gave me even more respect for the folks who've been in the streets protesting, exercising their rights. Yeah, we ended up having to do 2 shows. We planned to do one. We wanted to do it in support of the people of Minneapolis. It sold out in like 2 minutes. And so we did a second one where it was more of an interview show. We brought in Tim Walz and Tina Smith. We appreciate them for coming. And so look, my main takeaway is that I was a little bit humbled about something. I was wrong about something. I sit here in my room, and it is important to leave my hole and not just talk to the camera, because you can learn things. And I was really seeing Minnesota through a political prism, right? Like, obviously, like, I was just deeply just angered and saddened by what happened to Alex Preddy and Renee Good. And so there was a human element to it, but just my analysis of it was very political. And the political analysis was that it was a win, that the people of Minneapolis won. They defeated Trump. And they made him do something he doesn't like to do, which is back up, back down. And he does it a fair amount, but he doesn't like to do it. And so I went there in this mindset that it was almost not celebratory, but almost there was a little bit of a waving of the shirt. It was like, congratulations to the people of Minneapolis. And when I went to the Whipple building and talked to people that showed up to the events and had meals with activists, what I found out was that they had a political victory, and that's not nothing. It's meaningful, but like the occupation is ongoing, and the only difference is the tactics with which the government is using, right? And they've dispersed, And so I was talking to one woman, for example. She lives across the border in Wisconsin. She said about a 45-minute drive. She drives to the Whipple building, which is the main headquarters of where ICE has been staging. She protests every day for 3 hours. And I was talking to her, and she was like, look, my neighborhood in Wisconsin, we had seen, I think she said 4 ICE or CBP agents, in our little community text. We'd heard about 4, in the past, couple months. In the past week, there'd been 10. And that was just one anecdote, but there was more of that, like going out into North Minneapolis and even into South Dakota. And so, where I think the government feels like the thing that has worked with the resistance, which is monitoring and videoing and documenting their actions, that is easy to do in Minneapolis, where there's these built-in networks. It's harder to monitor and document if they go out into other regions of the country, other areas.
Are the tactics of the authorities less confrontational and one hopes less violent than we've seen in the recent past?
Well, again, this is all anecdotal, but there's some elements of demonstrating that it's craftier. Like the ICE agents have been putting on their cars, it's just like point counterpoint, it's like any sort of battle, right? The tactics shift. One thing that they've done is they start putting like gay pride stickers on the cars and other things to try to trick people into not, seeing that it was an ICE vehicle. And so, I think that the violence towards the protesters has dissipated, but is that because their tactics have dissipated, or because the manner in which they're doing this, puts them in, means that they're encountering organized protests less? You know what I mean? I think that still remains to be seen. I think that we can say meaningfully, like, Greg Bovino was trying to instigate fights, right? Like when he was walking around town, he was literally, he wanted violence. And so God loved the people of Minneapolis that this did not turn into anything that looked like, 2020, that there was not really any of that. So I think in, some ways the tactics have modified a little bit, but and the idea that people in Minneapolis are still, and around in the surrounding areas, are still having to like deliver food to families under cover of darkness. And there's a network of doulas. Tim Walz was telling us about this network of doulas that is helping give birth, people give birth because they don't want to go to hospitals.
Does it still feel, you said, you described it as an occupation. Does Minneapolis still feel like a city under the hand of an unwanted police presence, or is that hand more, does it feel like the hand is hidden and therefore it's not such an unwanted police presence?
I would not say that it felt like they were still under the hand, as if things were everywhere, as if these, secret police were everywhere. I will say this though, here's the way in which it still felt like an unwanted occupation. Yeah. When you talk to people, everyone had a story. Like everyone had an example of someone they know at the school, that their kids go to, or at work or in a community, right? So in that way, and I think that they were all still very conscious of the fact that this is ongoing. Like business as usual is not, like, it's not back to normal. And in that sense, I think it's still ongoing.
This leads me to a more challenging question that you and I have talked about in the past, and I want to hear your views, and I think many people want to hear your views on. Actually, I've got a couple of them that are a little more challenging. But the first is, so I'm not aware of this. I'm not a big, I'm not at the cutting edge of the latest in internet culture by any means.
Okay.
I'm not.
So you don't know about bone smashing?
Unfortunately, I do know about bone smashing, but that's only because people tell me. Sometimes the internet culture gets to a point where I'm not even sure it exists. I think it mostly exists in order to upset and shock people like me, not because there's any actual consumer of it. And why? I'm reading here in the New York Times about this very distressing thing that the young folks are doing online. Folding the sound of newsprint shuffling. Now, I wanted to ask you about something that I don't know how real this is, but people who keep up with this more than I do tell me that there is a mood among the young, that there's something lame about the project that you're engaged in, and I guess I'm engaged in too, of standing up for what they would call resistance liberalism. And this is somehow unfashionable, uncool. And I wonder, is this like a perception of something that actually exists, or is this just chat? And if it's to the extent it exists, let me ask you about two different strains that I can see for what's motivating it. One is, and there's just nothing to be done about this, is real leftists who say, look, you're standing up here for the Constitution, the rule of law, for international free trade, for you don't want to say open borders. You just want to say orderly police procedures without abuses and without violence. So you're not a real leftist. You're not smashing the system. You're not overturning the hierarchy. You're not socializing the means of production. You're not globalizing the intifada. It's just lame. So, okay, real leftists, I get why they would have a beef. But the other thing that it seems to be going on, to the extent that this is a real phenomenon I'm describing, is a feeling that simply having beliefs is in itself a sign of lameness. And that the cool thing is not to have any. Am I talking about anything real? You're at the center of this business. Do you see this? Am I describing something you recognize?
You are describing something real, unfortunately, and this stuff's all evolving and changing. But I think that that there is a sense among resist libs, or a sense among some, particularly younger folks in the public, that resist libs are corny and cringe. And I think that what is underlying this, like you said, for some people, there's ideological elements to it. But to me, what is underlying it is that like the most visible elements of resist liberalism are like people that seem like they are in the establishment or in positions of power, right? Like that they are protecting an existing order, right? And if you're just putting yourself in this, for a stereotype for a second, an imaginary 23-year-old, whether they're a Joe Rogan 23-year-old or a leftist Hassan Piker 23-year-old, who are they seeing when they, as the avatars of resist liberalism? It's like their parents, right? Probably, or people that seem like they are part of like an established older culture that they're trying to be a counterculture to, right? Like a lot of this is 8 stories old as time, right? It's like thesis, antithesis, synthesis, right? Like they have to rebel against something, and the resist liberals got in this weird position. Something I think about a lot, where we have no power, basically, right? But we're also seen as the establishment, and so how then can people that have these views like start to change that and start to appeal to a broader audience? And I think that Trump is doing a lot of favors right now in that sense, right? And I think that Trump, by engaging in such obvious corruption, but also by inciting up to the richest people in the world, and having all the trillionaires at his inauguration, and caring about what Jamie Dimon thinks, and also using the spy state of Palantir to go after people. I think there's like a combination of different things where you're starting to see cracks in this, and you are starting to, less so on the left because they have an ideological incentive to continue to position resist liberalism as cringe, but more on like in like the center and like the comedian podcast world, where they now they kind of went along with Trump because it was counterculture to whatever extent. You're seeing now elements of them start to say, wait a minute, maybe MSNBC had a few things right, like maybe that. Yeah. So I do think that there's a little bit of that cracking, but it is a problem and it exists. It's real.
Do you think there's any element of this? 2 of the 3 presidential candidates running against Donald Trump were women. And when people mock the resist libs, they often feminize
women,
what they have in mind. Wine moms.
Yes.
I don't imagine Hassan Piker's audience is very female. And is there something that there's a kind of leftism or nihilism that is especially attractive to young men, and that is sort of uncomfortable with the idea? The anti-Trump movement is in many ways a female-led movement. Sarah Longwell, and they're
I just said MSNBC. Look who are the big faces: Nicole Wallace and Rachel Maddow, right? Like, yeah.
There's a little bit of alienated young men being alienated not against their parents, but against their mothers.
Absolutely. It's funny that you say that because I don't even actually remember what I said when I said that when they see the resistance, did I say their parents? Because in my mind, I was thinking their mothers. I swear to God. Okay. I don't know if I said parents, but in my mind, I was thinking their mothers. And I think absolutely there is something to do with that. And I think that a lot of these young men, and look, Scott Galloway is good on this. I think that there are some legitimate issues that young men have in this country, and like ways in which they're left behind, and ways in which I rail at Democrats all the time about this, where I'm saying, look, you care about representation and making sure people feel seen in every instance for every group except for young men. Like, that's the one group that you don't think needs to feel seen. And if you understand the value of, quote, feeling seen and of representation, you should understand it. So like there's some legitimate element to this, but I think that those legitimate grievances are being preyed on, and that there are a lot of influences and folks that are either trying to ideologically prey on young men by turning them into right-wing nationalists, or far left agitators like Piker, or to the other thing that you mentioned, just blackpilling them, nihilism, right? Like this idea that that nothing matters, right? That there are these powerful institutions out there that are going to prevent you from having the success that your parents had, or having the glory that your father or grandfather had. And so why care about this? And that's a powerful, that's a powerful message, right? Like, I can understand why it's persuasive. And so I think that we can recognize that there is misogyny that is maybe, if not at the heart of this, a big element of it, while also saying that, okay, that doesn't mean that there isn't potentially powerful counter messages that could be delivered to these young men if an effort was put in.
So your background is in the world of messaging and political communication, and so it is not your nature ever to say to any substantial group of people, "You're just wrong."
Right.
But my business has always been a much less popular one, so I'm prepared sometimes to say to people,
"Okay,
you're just right." Like, isn't the job of saying, you know what, the United States in the summer of 2015, it hadn't recovered fast enough from the Great Recession. Many of its foreign policy commitments were not working as advertised, and people were frustrated with them. Got it. And there does seem to be a slowdown in the rate of growth compared to what previous generations had. And obviously there are the chronic problems of climate change and all true. Nevertheless, all of that calls for reform, not revolution. The system is basically good and fair and worth defending. And not only that, but individual action matters, and you shouldn't just tune out and defect from the political process. Sometimes you have to say to people, you're wrong. You're wrong about, and in cynicism doesn't make you smart. Cynicism makes you vulnerable.
I had a whole project it was centered around this with Cameron Kasky before he decided to run for Congress, as a young guy that started March for Our Lives, where we did a show, we interviewed young people. And so it wasn't entirely about this, but this topic came up a lot, right? Particularly with young men. And I found myself in the shoes of you, like making that case a lot, right? Which is like, okay, I hear you. Like your complaints are legitimate, but in the grand scheme of things, somebody that was a young man that was born in 1999, or whatever, 2002, has had some challenges, but they are a lot better off than young men and women who were born in basically almost all of the years of the past, frankly.
Right.
And so at some level you want to say like, oh, poor baby, right?
Welcome. Congratulations on your high school diploma, class of 1932.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Or like
class of 1941.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about the class that went through or like that graduated into, World War I and then the first plague and, like that you had the Depression. Yeah. So there were a lot of bad years out there. That said, like, okay, great. Like we're right. Now, but Donald Trump is the president and the most like the head of the FBI is a podcaster who is a total buffoon who preyed on these fears and did so successfully. So I guess my response to what you said is like, yes, it is true that it is overstated, like the grievances and the complaints of young men in the year 2026. But some of their complaints are real. And the job of people who are political practitioners is to win people over. And I think that there was insufficient effort in winning people over, in part because a lot of people on the left got into a bubble of their own where they were made to believe that these young men were something that they weren't, right? That they were like deeply, irredeemably racist, misogynist, problematic, whatever, followers of Joe Rogan. And it's kind of like, I don't know, actually, when you talk to most of them, they're like a lot of young men. They're reckless and dumb and have some strong views on things and have some unformed views on other things. And like that and Barack Obama appealed to that group very easily. And I kind of feel like had Barack Obama been the candidate in 2016, he would have appealed to them very easily again.
How do you personally adapt to this? I mean, you have a style that is very contemporary and very humorous, very demotic. And you're trying to bring people in. Does that
very
work?
Demonic?
Demonic, not demonic.
I knew. I was just making a joke.
The demos is the voice of God, not the voice. Anyway, but is that calculated as a way to overcome this problem, or is that just who you are and you couldn't be any other way?
It's mostly the latter, and I think that one of the things that has worked for the Bulwark is that all of us were cast out. And we're just able to kind of be ourselves and say what we really thought. And, I had a Democratic strategist once tell me after I got off TV, and they're like, I'm so jealous of you. I was like, why? And they said, well, even if I don't think I want to be White House press secretary ever again, like there's this little person in the back of my head that's saying, maybe I will be, and so I should soften the edges of whatever I'm going to say. And I just don't think any of us ever, I don't know. I think we all felt like, okay, that part of our life is over. Now we can just say what we think, and that's freeing. So part of that is I think natural, and but there is a calculated effort to try to reach different demographics. And I saw a pretty concerning poll of leaking about the Michigan Senate race, and I like Mallory McMorrow the best of those candidates. In candor, she is sort of she's about my age, and is very online and casual in the way that she speaks. There's more establishment, Haley Stevens, who's perfectly fine. And there's like a lefty candidate, Abdul Al-Sayed. And if you looked at the polls, McMorrow was doing the best among like 60 plus. And like, there's something I feel this, right? Like there's something about, I think, a generation older than me, like my parents' generation, who enjoy like consuming material, who like, oh, that's a young person that talks like a young person, and I like that. Like it's a little different, and it gets me out of my bubble. I learned some new things. But
then you get to the main race, where you see the same process sort of in play and likely to cost Democrats the Senate seat.
Right. Yeah, with Graham Plattner, right? And because he's, I don't know about likely to cost, but potentially it could cost him. It's a risk. It's a risk to have somebody like Graham Plattner in that race, right?
Actually, we should probably hit the pause button to explain who Graham Plattner is and what's going on in Maine.
Yeah. So the main race is Janet Mills. It's funny. This race is for me such a microcosm of of the problems of the Democratic Party, of like the two different factions. Janet Mills seems like a perfectly competent person, present governor in her late 70s. So she kind of represents a lot of what Biden represented, like has been a very competent governor, but is not exactly inspiring, seems out of touch with what people want. Then you have the Graham Plattner, who is this kind of left populist, younger candidate, oyster fisherman, tattoos, and speaks more normal and casually. And so there's an appeal there. I think there's more excitement around him, but has a lot of the baggage that left populists have, whether with their online past, like saying crazy shit, saying far left stuff. So now you get into a situation where it's like, well, okay, there are these two groups that the Democrats need to do well with, right? It's like our people, right? Like centrist, college-educated folks. Democrats have gained a lot of ground with them. And so Janet Mills will do fine with that group, right? But then there's this other group of like working class folks that the Obama to Trump voter to just use a shorthand, right? Working class voters that had traditionally voted Democrat that started to move more to the right. And there's a theory of the case that Graham Plattner types might appeal more to them. And so who can appeal to both, right? Like that becomes a fundamental problem, because you imagine there's this college-educated group that has moved more to the Democrats. Maybe some percentage of them look at Graham Plattner and Susan Collins and say, Susan Collins, not my cup of tea exactly, but I know what I'm getting with her, responsible, blah, blah, blah. It's not my point of view, but just, political analysis. And that cost Democrats a Senate race. You can imagine that. You can imagine on the other side, Janet Mills eking it out against Graham Plattner, and the types of people that Plattner appeals to don't turn out to vote in a midterm election. They're just like, I'm not the type of person to vote in a midterm election. Susan Collins wins. So it's a conundrum. It's a pickle. Hopefully Donald Trump screws things up enough that there's a big enough wave to carry either of them through. But I do think that it's a problem with the party. And just like one last thing, just circling it back to how I think about my role. It's like, I do think about like, how can I talk to the people that Plattner's appealing to? Because maybe, particularly in the younger men side of things, because maybe I'm the type of person as a former Republican who like watches football and talks casually that they would listen to when they might not listen to because of misogyny or whatever, some of the other voices.
The last thought before we close this subject. On the rare occasions when anyone asks me for political advice, I say when you get to the final round, there are two candidates. You have a 1 in 2 chance of winning, a 1 in 2 chance of losing. So there's a reasonable statistical probability that you're going to lose. You should think in advance. If you lose, how and why would you like to lose? Because it's a terrible thing to lose for things you didn't believe in, to lose because of positioning, to lose because you weren't yourself. If you lose because you were yourself, you can live with that. If you lose over issues that you feel are important, you can live with that. And so I sometimes think as I listen to this detraction, you know what? If democracy loses because the defenders of democracy were too serious about it, too earnest, too believed in it too much, then at least we lost the fight the way we wanted to fight the fight.
I'll just say one thing about this. We totally agree at the candidate level. And having worked for a lot of losing candidates, particularly in primaries, I've given this same speech to probably 4 or 5 people, and said, hey, you go down with integrity, go down with dignity. Don't do it any other way. And then I agree with you. At a macro level, though, at a scale, I guess I have a slight disagreement. I do think it is incumbent upon the people who see the threat to our country, to our democracy seriously, to try to grapple seriously with how to thwart it. And I guess my point is, I don't want people to not do things because they're high on their own supply about their norms and their values, and be true to yourself, be true to your values, but also look, like we only have 2 parties. Okay. So you're getting 60 million votes, right? Like the country is big and diverse. Every successful winning coalition in the history of this country has had cranks in it, has had racists in it, has had stupid people in it, right? Like that's just how you have to win. And, this is not like, a European country where there are 7 parties and you only need to win 22% of the vote to get a plurality, right? That's part of the deal. And so I just don't want to write people off. And I think sometimes my critique of people in our movement is that they write people off because they don't have the right thoughts or the right views on everything. And so then they're problematic and they're not worth appealing to. And I guess that's all I'm arguing, is that it's worth at least trying to appeal to them.
Well, since you raised coalition politics, let me ask you, and this is the last challenge I want to put to you. As you said, the Bulwark began as an extension of the Weekly Standard, of certain kind of subsection of conservative politics, and that's the life story of the core group that runs the Bulwark. But you have discovered this extraordinary new appeal in a much wider set of viewers and listeners who tilt more to the liberal side and even to the left. Probably the median Bulwark fan in 2026 was not voting for George W. Bush in 2003 if they were active in 2003. How do you find a stopping place? Saying when you and I were talking about this in advance, I mentioned that there is a kind of very favorable treatment of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez by you and by Bill Kristol. That you had Zoran Mamdani on, and you gave him a tough question, and indeed you asked the question that has caused him the single greatest difficulty of anybody. So I don't want to slight that, but how do you say this is who we are, and this is who we used to be, this is who we are not going to become, and this is where we don't go? How do you think about those questions?
I appreciate this because it is. Like, it's complicated, and I'm evolving my views about it all the time. And I say that because, one of the benefits of having a daily podcast is getting to bring smart people on is I get to hear smart people's opinions. And sometimes people say things that makes me think about things in a different way. And so I want to frame this up in that sense, where I'm trying to think about the best way to solve the last question, right? Like, how do we protect the country? And sometimes the answer to that, it does not necessarily align with what my particular policy priors are, right? And so how do you think about that? How do you integrate that like information, and how do I talk about those types of politicians, those types of issues, without being untrue to myself or without doing audience capture, et cetera? The audience capture problem is easy because like once a month I do my best to just piss everybody off as much as possible about a topic. Like I find a topic that I know that the left part of the audience does not agree with me on, and I'm like, you know what, I'm going to do 2 more segments on this than I should, just so we can clean out any false assessments that I'm going to go along with every crazy thing that the left wants me to go along with. But what the red lines are. The best way to answer this question I think about, and we've all talked about this and thought about it, is around the word illiberalism, right? Like what is our core mission right now? And to me, it is in defense of liberal democracy, not like necessarily limousine liberalism, not liberalism in that sense, but in the sense of the values that undergird liberal democracy that have made our society work, and which is not too dissimilar to the constitutional values, right? To our old conservative points of views, like the values that are in the Declaration. And so to the extent that there is illiberalism that spouts up on the left, I think that it's important for us to oppose it or call it out. I think it's also important for us to think about, like, just because you are in favor of liberal values and American traditions doesn't mean that there can't be reforms. In order to defend liberal democracy, you have to defend every institution that has become sclerotic and that has, developed in our liberal democracy. And I don't think that, but I just mean like the underlying values. And so, the threat from illiberalism to me very clearly at this point comes from the right. And one line I like to use is like, if somebody came up to me with a gun and said, you get to be the one that decides the future of the country. Do you want it to look like Orban's Hungary, or do you want it to look like a Scandinavian social democracy? Like, they wouldn't have to even put their hand to their holster before I'd say a Scandinavian social democracy. It doesn't have all my preferred economic views or any other views, but it's just not close. Like, the threat is from illiberalism. And so when I look at a person like Zoran or AOC, I think what we see is there are definitely some illiberal left views that they've held in the past. I think also that both of them have demonstrated that they are trying to appeal to folks outside of that, whatever, that DSA cul-de-sac. They're trying. So I think it's important to talk about that.
I want to put a pause button there because I think you're combining two things that in my mind, at least, are different things. So let's bracket Zoran Mamdani, who I regard as a more sinister figure than maybe you do. But let's talk about AOC. I agree. I think AOC is absolutely a normal American politician. And I have no doubt that if she were to somehow become president, if she's got a Supreme Court order saying don't do this, she wouldn't do it. And I don't think she would run a meme coin business while being president. So if the question is this person an acceptable and unalarming, an unthreatening participant in American democracy? Yeah, absolutely, she is. I can imagine that the scope of unthreatening American politics extends to her, and then extends, Marco Rubio to AOC, that's sort of the universe. If, however you say, I, David Frum, at this microphone, or you, Tim Miller, at your microphone, do I support her? I can draw a line by saying I don't find her threatening, but no, I don't. And I'm not the master. I'm not determining the outcomes of American politics. I'm just speaking for myself. And I can both say I find her, and if the choice were AOC or Trump, I would very unhappily and with a lot of foot dragging and grumbling and complaining to my loved ones have to put up with AOC. But if the choice is AOC or somebody else, I choose somebody else. And I remember that when I talk and write about her. Again, Zoran Mamdani, I want to bracket because I think that's a different kettle of fish. But so you and your work, I mean, like one of the things that led to the favorable treatment she got was a misstatement she made, and I don't want to mock her for it. It's a natural one. She said trans-Pacific when she meant transatlantic, which is not such a big mistake, except the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a very specific piece of legislation that the left destroyed and that I, for one, lament. And the Transatlantic Partnership is a much vaguer, more notional idea.
Okay. I want to talk first about the question of whether we support her, and then we'll get to the favorable treatment that me and Bill gave her on the podcast about a week ago. I wouldn't say that I support her. No. I also think, for me, look, Donald Trump got elected twice in this country. Donald Trump, who I regard to be totally unacceptable and moronic and unappealing, and for whom there was never even a moment for me where I was like, I get it. I see what people like in this person. I find him repulsive, and I have all the way since 2012. And so if Donald Trump gets elected first time, makes you think about some things. If then he tries to, overturn our democracy and instigates a riot at the Capitol that causes the death of police officers, and then people elect him again, that makes me think, okay, well, look, I mean, sure, the easy thing to do is say, well, it was bad luck because of inflation. But to me, I think that there should have been no type of inflationary environment that should have led to Donald Trump getting elected again after January 6th. And so, and yet he did. And so I guess an analyst of our politics and as somebody who cares deeply of trying to get us out of this, have to look at that and say, okay, well, the Democrats have to do something differently, right? They doing the same thing over and over again and putting up somebody else in the Hillary to Harris, kind of wing of the party, or with their similar positions and with their similar affect, that would be a mistake. And so, as I look ahead to 2028, I feel like what my job is as a podcast host is to try to encourage Democrats to look at different options. Now, AOC is not going to be my kettle of fish, as you said. I think that there would, God willing, there'll be multiple candidates that I prefer a lot more. But I think that there's things that she's doing that's very interesting and important that other Democrats I like better should learn from. For starters, she has a differentiated brand from an unpopular Democratic Party. Number two, she talks like herself on social media. She's very relatable and authentic. Number three, she has some, again, these are all towards the left, but she has heterodox views that differentiate herself. I think that for a Democrat to be successful, barring luck, sometimes you can get successful luckily, as you mentioned, if there are only two candidates, it's you have a coin flip's chance. But for them to be actually successful, Democrats should learn from Obama and Trump and the successful politicians and differentiate themselves from an unpopular establishment of their party. And AOC is doing that. I have not seen a lot of that from the center left. I hope to encourage some of them to learn from the good parts of AOC and not take some of her more troubling positions. And so, to now getting back to Bill Kristol, like to the extent that I give her plaudits for anything, it's usually one, for doing that thing I think Democrats need to do. And two, it's, when she shows some glimmers of saying, hey, I plan to be more responsible than some others on the left, I think it's okay to note that. I think it's okay to note that AOC, while she flubbed it and fucked up, we got to grade her on a curve, but so did George W. Bush, flubbed and fucked up his first appearances on the world stage, and we graded him on a curve. But like, we can both say she flubbed. And also, I thought her speech was more responsible than Marcos. That's my final sentence. I thought her speech was more responsible.
I prefer the flub. I love the flub. I got excited about the flub. The Trans-Pacific part, be still my heart. Yeah. Trans-Pacific free trade, that you're talking my language.
Yeah. Oh, anyway, my final point was just, I thought her speech was more responsible than Marcos. Period. Yeah. End of story. Does that mean that I'm going to agree with all of her foreign policy better than, you know what I mean? Like, there are a lot of other things, but that's just speaking about that speech.
Let me move the camera a little bit from AOC and back more directly upon you. So, in politics, we have both as individuals, we have red lines, things we cannot accept, and green flags, things we believe in and are excited about. Mine would include U.S. global leadership of democratic nations, free trade abroad, free commerce at home, constitutional restraints on the government, but also fiscal responsibility, generally preferring a government that taxes less.
That's a red line for you?
No, that's my green flag.
Oh, that's a green flag. I was going to say, that's a red line you've not had anyone to support for 40 years.
No, the red lines are the things where you say, I will fight against this in the company of anybody. Sometimes when you're battling the red lines, you can forget what your green flags were or should be or used to be. In fact, this is the story of the first neoconservatives. They began by being upset about disorder in the cities of the industrial Northeast and Midwest in the 1960s, and pretty soon they become completely different people with a kind of, Andrew Sullivan calls it the neocon slide. And that's just natural, but it's also something that maybe you want to make sure I'm making my own decisions about where I go. I'm not being pushed by the force of events.
Yeah. No, I understand that. I'm very conscious of it. I always think about like the thing I most took from Jeb, speaking of my losing campaigns, is he had a phrase that he liked to use that, what was his North Star was that making sure that people had an opportunity to live a chance of purpose and meaning, or had an opportunity to live a life of purpose and meaning. And that's what's the government's job. It doesn't mean you had to give people purpose, right? Like if people didn't want to find purpose in their life, they could go and, make fools of themselves, and we'd have a kind of a minimum safety net to make sure that they could enjoy the life part of having a life of purpose and meaning. But like, we couldn't give people purpose and meaning. We had to give them opportunities too. And that the government should do what was possible to nourish that. And that the government shouldn't do anything that would infringe on it. Right. And you can think about any policy kind of through that prism. And so like, when I see things on the left that I think are dehumanizing, are preventing people from being able to do that, I want to speak out about it. I mean, I'm trying. Like, I know you want to speak more in the policy space, but like, just one thing that just jumped straight to mind that was a red line for me that I said very clearly in the podcast was there were I had a pretty disturbing amount of people that came up to me and said that they were basically okay with Charlie Kirk's assassination, like that somewhere between didn't bother them and they celebrated it, and I was just horrified by that. I was like, no. I believe in humans' ability to grow and change and be redeemed. That's why in Hillary's deplorables line, when she called the MAGA the basket of deplorables, I didn't mind deplorables because they are, but I didn't like that the next thing she used was irredeemable. A lot of these people are deplorable and irredeemable. No, almost everyone. I don't know if Stephen Miller's redeemable. Almost everyone is redeemable in the eyes of God. And so my view is, I had to speak out. I had to say, no, like I will not actually be side by side with somebody who believes that political violence is either appropriate or allowed or encouraged in service of some broader democratic goal. I won't. Like, even if it's rhetorical, I won't give any aid and comfort to that. That seems like a very low bar. Unfortunately, we live in a society where the bar is pretty low. We saw a similar thing with Luigi Mangione and others. And so look, I think that it's important to like have a North Star, to know where the guardrails are. I just also think in the context of AOC and Zoran that like we live in a world where like the old way of thinking led us to 2 Donald Trump terms and led us really to the brink of potentially losing our democracy. I'm more open to creative solutions to that and other solutions that are outside of what my green flags are of fiscal responsibility. And, like I'm more open. I want fiscal responsibility. I want cutting red tape. I would love for those to be elements of a broad coalition that allows us to get our society back on track. I'm also open to the possibility that there might be other more effective ways of reaching the types of people that Donald Trump reached. And so when I analyze AOC and Zoran, I just try to be mindful of that.
I sometimes think, I hope this is an accurate quote, or that it's an authentic quote and that I'm reproducing it accurately. But I recall Friedrich Hayek once saying that when he was a young man of 20, the only people who could speak to with mutual understanding were old men of 80. And now that he's an old man of 80, the only people he could speak to were people of 20.
I feel that really hard. Like,
but what he specifically meant was he had been 20 at the beginning of an era of authoritarianism and war and statism and control. And that was the common stuff of politics. And you had to be kind of a screwy oddball at age 20 in 1917, when I think he was 20, to I still believe in freedom and limited government and a world in which goods and people move. And only at the end were those things rediscovered. And so we say the old ideas have failed. Well, there were the old ideas and there was failure. Have the old ideas failed, or is liberty an idea that's eternal in you?
Liberty is an idea that is eternal in me, for sure. And I think that I do believe that over the long arc of history, like it will continue to bear itself out. And I think that the basic ideas of why I became a Republican, of free markets and free people, will bear themselves out. And I think that my pushback to a lot of what Trump is doing is in that spirit. Right? Like his administration is a direct assault on liberty and free markets and free people. And so I guess my not caveat, because I would not be for someone that was anti-liberty. I would not be for someone that wanted to subjugate a certain group of people, even if they were MAGA people I don't like. But I also think that like the specific recognizing the trends, recognize like the patterns is the word I was looking for. But this is not the first time we've been through this, to your point with Hayek, right? And if in order to get out of it, we need to have an intermediating period where there are people that do not share like my total ideology, but who I can stand side by side with in protection of liberty and in opposition to the fascist creep. I think that it is important to do that in ways that are strategic and smart. And I think that there are limits on that, but also, I think that being an old man shouting at the clouds going, if only we had stuck to our guns on Simpson Bowls and on whatever, like while, Baron Trump like reigns supreme over the land. Like, I don't want to be that person either. And so I think that these are, it's a complicated topic and it's a challenging one. I appreciate the challenge, but like, that's kind of how I look at it. I hope that this makes sense.
The Atlantic editors advised me to footnote things that need to be footnoted, but you know what? I'm just going to let Simpson Bowls pass into the dust of history without elaboration. Those who remember, they remember. And those who never knew, they're not missing anything. Tim Miller, thank you so much. Those are beautiful and wise last words. I'm so grateful you joined today.
Thank you, David. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much to Tim Miller for joining me today on The David Frum Show. As I mentioned at the top of the program, my literary discussion this week will be an evaluation, an assessment of the State of the Union address as a ritual. Now, as you know, the Constitution requires that the president from time to time give information to Congress on the State of the Union and make recommendations to Congress about the State of the Union. That constitutional injunction has become the basis of a ritual that commands the attention of the world. The president of the United States standing in front of two houses of Congress, House and Senate, with the Supreme Court in attendance, the chair, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, other distinguished people, senior representatives of his administration, the cabinet. It's a statement that whatever partisan divisions Americans may have, on this day, for this ritual, Americans are united. Now, not everybody claps at the same thing, but there's an expectation of decorum. Even people who are strongly opposed to the president's programs or policies are supposed to sit quietly and listen to what the president has to say. And it's considered quite shocking if there's an outburst of dissent or interruption or heckling from anybody in the room. It's happened before and has always been regarded as a grave scandal. You're supposed to sit there and listen politely as the president speaks. Well, as I said before, I'm recording this before we know what President Trump did on his 2026 State of the Union. But there's a pretty high likelihood he's going to do something untoward. I mean, the Supreme Court is supposed to be there. Trump has called them all kinds of names for the tariff decision, has said should be ashamed of themselves and their family should be ashamed of them, has even suggested that they might be in some kind of thrall to a foreign power. The House and Senate will be there. President Trump recently tried to indict 4 members of the House and 2 senators for things they said, in violation not only of the First Amendment, but of the speech and debate rights of members of Congress, House, and Senate. President Trump has formally opened an investigation into one Federal Reserve governor, Lisa Cook, and is making a lot of noises about investigating and indicting the chairman, the outgoing chairman, Jay Powell. And who hasn't he insulted in that room? If you were a potential guest at the Trump State of the Union 2026, you'd want to think twice. I'm going to have to sit in my seat. I'm going to have to behave in a respectful way. And the president might say or do anything. One of the destructive features of the Trump presidency has been the way his inability to control himself, his inability to respect the rules of the game, has actually changed the game. It isn't just Donald Trump who behaves worse. And people in response to Donald Trump are put into a position where they either match his behavior, or they look like suckers and fools, or they look like victims who are bullied by him and intimidated by him. And so you've begun to hear talk of a number of members of the House and Senate saying they do not want to attend the State of the Union, and maybe they will not. Some people have suggested there might be a lot of visible empty seats, or seats where Donald Trump and his people will have to hastily scurry to put extra bodies where the senators and members of the House should go. It's a hard thing to think about, because even those of us who most want to retain the great traditions of the American Republic, the symbolic demonstrations of unity, have to say, if somebody asked me, if a member of the House and Senate asked me, should they attend, I'd have a hard time telling them that it's a good idea. I think we are being pushed toward an evaluation of whether this tradition may have outlived its usefulness, at least so long as Donald Trump is present. Remember, while the president is obliged and required to make a report to Congress, there's no requirement that he do so in person. From Thomas Jefferson's time to Woodrow Wilson, the State of the Union was submitted in writing. Thomas Jefferson broke with the precedent of his predecessors, Washington and Adams. He thought that the State of the Union address reminded him too much of a British speech from the throne. Plus, he hated public speaking. So he submitted his reports in writing. And so it continued until Woodrow Wilson returned to the spoken form. In 1973, Richard Nixon went back to the speech in writing. He sent 6 statements in writing to Congress. He did not speak that year. There's no reason that this can't be done in writing. It's just a tradition. It's just a practice. And it may be time, as long as Donald Trump is president, to rethink this. And for the next Congress, remember the president is there the president is before the 2 houses as a guest. That's why the Speaker of the House begins by saying, "It is my honor and privilege." I forget the exact phrase. The Congress invites the president to enter its chamber and to speak to both House and Senate. That invitation doesn't have to be extended. Congress could say, you know what, President Trump, if you're going to insult the Supreme Court, if you're going to abuse members of the House and Senate, if you're going to try to arrest us for things we've said or indict us for things we said, why don't you put your thoughts in writing? Send it to us in writing. If it was good enough for William Howard Taft, it should be good enough for you. So put it in writing. We'll read it. We'll debate it. But we don't want you on our platform insulting and abusing the people here, people whom you've tried to arrest and are opening bogus criminal investigations into. Put it in writing. You stay home. We'll read it. We'll get back to you at our earliest convenience. Thanks so much for joining me today. Thanks to Tim Miller for being my guest. Remember the best way to support the work of this podcast, if you're so minded, is by subscribing to The Atlantic. That's the best way to support me and all of my colleagues. Thanks so much for joining me today on The David Frum Show. See you next week. Bye-bye.